All right, good afternoon. Oh, wow, it's late. It's the 5 o'clock time slot. We're the only thing standing between you and a stiff drink. Sona said to me before, you know, Peter and Ari, it's your job to talk and the audience's job to listen. We're just concerned that you're going to stop before we do. So let's stick with us here. Let's try it again. Good afternoon, everybody. All right, not bad. So Ari and I were in the green room behind just a moment ago, and he said he was so hoping that somebody in the audience would ask him, as a senior member of the FBI, what were the proper circumstances of Jim Comey's firing from the FBI? What were the circumstances of General Flynn's firing from the White House? And if any of you could throw in something about Secretary Clinton's emails as part of that, then that would be the trifecta, and he would just be so happy. So just for a moment, if we could just express, all of us, our appreciation, not just to Ari, but really all the special agents and staff, that particularly in the wake of yesterday's terrorist attacks, keep us safe fundamentally in this country. So would you help me, please? Thank you. Okay, so I'm really bummed because basically I didn't know about that whole Winnie interview that was just going to go on. So like my opening lines have just been like slashed and I don't really know where to go. But work with me here, everybody, okay? So what are the most significant hacks of really the last year? What comes to mind? Okay, Podesta, some of the broader elections. What else? Okay, there's so many we can't even remember. The October hack, what else? Yahoo. Big deal, right? Big M&A ramifications. What else? Sony, JP Morgan. What else? Yep. Shadow brokers you heard about, the people who are supposedly taking tools.
Peter, maybe the one hack that actually got cybersecurity and breaches on the front pages, Ashley Madison.
I think the heading is Life is an Affair.
That's right.
Something along those lines. WannaCry, obviously. The Panama Papers. This is a legal audience, right? Man, the Panama Papers. Think about that. What happened to the clients of the Panama Papers? What was the name of the law firm? Mossack Fonseca, right? What happened to the clients of Mossack Fonseca? Not a lot of good things, though, right? The Icelandic prime minister resigned. David Cameron had ramifications. Vladimir Putin. Apparently, they had information on public accounts of something like 200,000 public officials at this law firm. So that's the clients, if that doesn't get you thinking. How about what happened to the two founders of Mossack Fonseca? Nothing. I'm not sure that nothing is quite right. Anybody have a sense? Jail. So allegations or information came out about the Lava Jato scandal in Brazil, the car wash scandal, and so they've been charged with bribery now, and were actually held in jail in Panama for over a month before their bail was just granted. So really incredible array of news. What really stood out about WannaCry? It's been all over the newspapers for the last 2 weeks. What are the things in your head that really sticks with you? Number of countries, for sure. Yep, indeed. Impact on the NHS hospitals in Britain, 48 different hospitals that were immediately, within a matter of hours, impacted by it. What else? Yeah, really interesting. Maybe, Ari, you can help us understand that a little bit. But just first, how about like the propagation concept? You know, we're really used to spear phishing. How many of you have a sense of what spear phishing is? Right? Winnie was just talking about it. You get your LinkedIn accounts, you get your Twitter, they send you a nice bespoke email that is from your kid's daycare center or from your recent alumni from the college that they know that you went to, and you click on that. So it's a human interaction that then allows the malware into your system. But that can't necessarily move quite as quickly. The WannaCry went and infected 230,000 computers in the span of 48 hours. So how did that happen? Yeah, exactly. So it's called a worm. So it went from it just like hopscotch from computer to computer, because when you have two computers, you have like 1,000 different ports that connect those computers. There's like an email port, and then there's also a file sharing port. And they figured out how to get into that file sharing. And so you didn't need the human to click on the spear phishing email. It just booked from computer to computer to computer across continents and the like, and really extraordinary things. So just quickly, ransomware, right? It sounds pretty petty. It was $300 to get your data supposedly back. Not a really big deal. But if you start talking about hospitals not able to provide critical care to people in emergency rooms and the like, you start just beginning to understand how vulnerable society has become, obviously, as we're outrageously interconnected. So, Ari, can you talk us about a little bit about just the threat environment and maybe cover the kill switch on WannaCry? What does that mean?
So we'll touch on the kill switch first. And this is a good example of the way the design and the execution of these malwares that are being propagated across the cyber world is increasing in sophistication. The kill switch was something that was embedded. It was a line of code that was embedded inside the actual program, the script, that if turned on, would actually turn the worm, the propagation, off. Without getting into too much technical on how that actually functions, it was almost a self-destruct mechanism. You say, well, why do that? One of the reasons to do that is so that those who are behind the attack, they have a way to kill it, to eliminate the breadcrumb trail, if you will, back to them so that it makes it more difficult for investigators to follow that trail and identify who was behind it. So that's one of the main reasons why they would do that. But Ganesh set it up greatly, and Winnie did a great job in terms of talking about the threat landscape. But one of the things we do in the FBI in order to sort of understand the threat that we're dealing with and really track the progression of the sophistication and complexity of the attacks, not only in its design and execution, is take a look at them, develop our pillars so that we can also prioritize our resources. As everybody in this room, we're always being asked to do more with less. And so one of the ways we can address these threats is to really take a hard look at it. So from the FBI perspective, the way we see the threat, we'll put it in a food pyramid filled with a whole bunch of things nobody really wants to munch on because it's just all bad. But at the very top, at the tip of that pyramid, is our nation-state actors. And yes, we will mention here Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, and probably in that order as well in terms of sophistication. The primary purpose of the nation-state intrusions is so that they can create disruption, but also to gain an economic and/or military advantage. These are just some of the countries that are engaging in the state-sponsored. They're certainly the more prolific countries that are engaging in state-sponsored intrusions. And that's not to say there aren't legitimate business dealings to engage with, but always understand that they are after a little bit more. Next down the line, and this category has kind of moved up a little bit, is the insider threat. So we can do as much as we can in terms of building up the defenses, building up the walls around our network. But what are we doing in terms of those who are inside the walls, inside the wire? How do we prevent that? And so that's a twofold threat there. You have the intentional insider and you have the unintentional insider. The intentional insider may be that individual who's hearing rumors about their imminent dismissal, and so they have inappropriate accesses and authorities on the networks, and so they'll go in there, write maybe a simple script that says to the payroll section, if my name is removed from payroll, remove all the information. And all of a sudden, all your data is lost. That's the intentional insider. The unintentional insider is actually somebody who has their heart in the right place, but is just maybe becoming a little bit lax in security protocols in favor of productivity. Nevertheless, the result is the same. You still have damage to the network and all the other things that happen and come along with that. As we move down the line, we'll take a look at the criminal syndicates, the transnational organized criminal syndicates. They're simply in the business of stealing your information and selling it to the highest bidder. Plain and simple. It's a money issue for them. They've found a way to monetize the personally identifiable information sell maybe one profile for 25 cents on the Tor network, right? That part of the web that hasn't been indexed yet. Well, you say 25 cents isn't a lot, right? But when you multiply that by 80 million accounts, they're starting to talk about real money right there. We talk about the purveyors of ransomware, WannaCry. We touched on that already. The purveyors of ransomware, they too have found a way to monetize it. The ransomware, as we know, is a virus, or in this particular instance, a worm that's able to get into your network, encrypt your files, thereby rendering them unreadable, inaccessible to you until you pay a ransom. So 200, 300,000 victims of this particular WannaCry ransomware. If we do it at $300, which was the initial ransom demand, which has now doubled to $600, you're talking $45 million if only half pay that money. What's interesting, though, is what's been reported is the ransomware has generated 90,000, approximately 1,000 victims, 90,000 in revenue, but in none of those circumstances has the decryption key been provided to the victim to unlock the information. And so that's why we, the FBI, do not advocate for the paying of the ransom. It's like a virus that's taken over here in this country and certainly globally as well. And we've seen that again just with this one example, but it's been going on for a long time. We don't advocate paying for the ransom because all it does is perpetuate that economic cycle, that business model, and in many instances, as we see with WannaCry, it's just not even being provided to you, the decryption key. So you're still stuck, and maybe you're going to pay again a second time. I'm sure we'll touch on this a little bit later on, but there's some basic fundamental technical things that we should all be capable of doing that can better prepare ourselves for a ransomware attack. The last two categories, again, we have the hacktivists, a motley collection of individuals, maybe in the basement of their homes, where for them it's not so much driven by money or the economy, but rather sending a message, ideological, political. They want to send a message out there. And so in that vein, we see them being very disruptive behind a lot of dedicated denial of service attacks. Finally, what we see are cyber terrorists. Well, why are they at the bottom of the stack is really a question I always get. So with regard to the cyber terrorists, we know that they have certainly become sophisticated and proficient in the use of the internet and certainly social media platforms on the smartphones to communicate with their followers and plan attacks. What we haven't seen them do yet, and we're keeping a close eye on them, is actually engage in computer network intrusions. It stands to reason, though, that because they have become sophisticated with regard to the use of social media and communication, that at some point they might be able to recruit somebody who is technically capable of conducting some kind of computer intrusion. And in this instance, one of the concerns would be not so much going after somebody for financial gain, although that's a possibility as well because terrorist activity requires finances to fund. However, maybe the bigger concern might be an attack on the critical infrastructure. And so if we talk about that just for a slight second, just pause for a second and think about this. If there was an attack on the New York City 911 system, thereby eliminating communication between the fire, the police, emergency medical services, maybe also impacting telecommunications and energy at the same time. What do you think would happen here in this city? We have a great city. We have a lot of redundancies in place. Our police department is #1 in the world. New York City Police Department, the great men and women of the police department will do their best certainly to protect us and to make sure things are maintained nice and orderly. However, that kind of reaction, that kind of an attack would wreak havoc. So that's kind of how we see the landscape from top to bottom.
That gin and tonic is looking better and better at 6 o'clock here. All right. Has anybody used Bitcoin for anything? Nobody. Interesting. So a Japanese airline yesterday just announced that they're the first company, the first airline that is going to accept Bitcoin payments. How much is a Bitcoin cost? Anybody know? So $2,000. A little bit more than $200. $2,000. But it fluctuates all over the place. So the Winklevoss twins, for example, they're supposedly trying to get a Bitcoin ETF because literally the price is gyrating around based on whether it's used for ransomware or just used as an alternative form of currency, which is pretty fascinating. So, Ari, you spoke about Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. What is different about their signatures? Is there one country that's particularly focused on espionage versus financial crime, or the types of tools that they use?
So everybody has their own unique way of sort of, from the nation-state perspective, engaging in their activity. The Russians are certainly the most sophisticated. They have good funding behind them, and all of this requires funding. They're patient, and they try to do things consistent with what their long-term vision is. The same with the Chinese. I think the distinction with the Chinese, we use the Chinese as an example to show how the attack changes over time. The Chinese, historically, when they first started to engage in nation-state attacks, they were very loud. It was like the burglar coming to your home and just checking to see if the door lock was open, checking to see if the window was open. They didn't care. They wanted to come in, they wanted to attack, take what they could and get out. Well, recently, a couple of years ago, we conducted an investigation that resulted in the indictment of 7 PLA members, and that kind of slowed things down and caused a little change in sort of their approach. So now, the Chinese, again, consistent with what their long-term vision is and where they want to see themselves and how they project themselves maybe 50, 100 years down the road, they are more slow, they are more methodical, and it's almost like, you know, death by 1,000 cuts here. They want to hit, and then they'll back off and see. So with that, I asked the question, how many of you know what the average number of days is that a bad actor may be on your network before it's realized? Say again? Over 6 months. Definitely over 6 months. That's it, right? So we're going to 210 days, but that's not the average. That's generally here in the U.S. When we take the European model and look at how long it takes them to realize what's going on, to the extent that we're aware of it, right? Because we've been, you know, and I think Peter will talk about this in a minute, the average goes a lot higher. And so that goes to the idea that once I gain entry, I'm not going to be quick to remove the information. I'm going to take my time. I'm going to move laterally across the network. I want to find that area of your network that has the crown jewels. That's what's going to give it to me. And so in that sense, they've progressed. That model has progressed from hit hard and get out quick to slow and methodical.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Just pause there for a moment. Anybody have any questions?
Of course, but here in the U.S., obviously.
So let's focus law firms in the U.S. Ari, what have you seen?
So it reminds me of a story, and Peter and I shared this in the back room before we came out here. So, you know, many years ago, we had the very famous Willy Sutton bank robber. You guys remember him, or at least the story? You know, Slick Willy, he had so many disguises, he had so many nicknames as well. Well, he gets apprehended, and he's put in jail, and there's a reporter that comes along, and the story goes that he was asked, hey, Willy, why do you rob banks? Who knows what the answer was? It's where the money was, right? So when we look at cyber attacks, and we can say, well, the big money is in the financial sector, and certainly it is, right? We have them, whether it's a hedge fund company or one of the big major banks or the stock market, right? But who's involved in all of that activity? Lawyers. And so you all have that information that's considered valuable. And so I'll drive the point home with 2 quick examples. There was a case in a very big law firm that I'm sure many of you know, I won't name, but in this particular case, the law firm's networks were compromised, M&A information was taken, and it was traded upon. We worked very closely with them, and because of their assistance and the collaboration with the FBI, we were able to identify the 3 people behind it, all of whom have been indicted, 1 who is in custody pending extradition. So they stole valuable information related to M&A, traded on it, and made millions of dollars, several million. There's another case where we talk about a compromise of a law firm's email server so that the malicious actor, the bad guy sitting behind the screen, was actually looking at email communications going back and forth from the attorney to the client. And when that conversation moved to escrow accounts, and at the direction of the attorney, the client was to move the escrow account into this account number. Well, that was like a beautiful green flag for the guy or gal watching that communication, because shortly thereafter, the next email goes out and says, you know what, I've changed my mind. Why don't you send it to this account? By the time the reconciliation takes place and they realize what happened, money's gone.
So this is a very unusual audience in that you have substantial number of law firm participants and then also corporate. How many of you are from law firms? How many of you from corporate law departments? Yeah, it's a really 50-50 split. So part of what we're trying to do with this is not just scare the bejesus out of everybody, which there's plenty of material to work with.
I'm scary enough, aren't I?
You're a scary-looking dude, Ari, but that's a separate issue.
It's the shine.
But kind of what can you do specifically in this dynamic that most of us are spending our time working on? So have any of you heard of what's called transport layer security? This is something that everybody should write down. So as a company, for example, we're saying to our law firms, to Wachtell, to Cravath, to Davis Polk and the like, that we want you to set up essentially a trunk line on the internet just between our company and the lawyers who will be interacting with the lawyers at Wachtell, for example, and then Wachtell sets up the same trunk line going back. It essentially has the domains from the law firm and from the corporation that sync up in like a poor man's blockchain. Think of it as something like that. And it's not foolproof, but it's actually really quite good, and it is very straightforward to do. Your IT departments, whether at the law firm or the corporation, can implement that within a matter of really a day. It's not hugely expensive, and it's really quite simple to do. So that's one good takeaway for you. Another thing that we should all be thinking about is just while the threat environment has changed dramatically, the regulatory environment has almost changed as quickly. So what are big new laws or big new regulations that have come out just in the last few months? DFS, what does that mean? Yeah, big new regulation coming out, really probably the most sophisticated at a state level in the U.S., mandating a whole bunch of things that we can talk about. What else? How about Europe? How many of you have operations in Europe? Okay. What's the big new thing that's coming down the pipe in Europe? GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. So Ari spoke about the dwell time in the U.S. being something, dwell time being the amount of time that an attacker is in your system before you or a third party figures out that they're in your system. It's 210 days, roughly, a little bit less maybe in the U.S. In Europe, it's about 470 days. So think about just the ramifications of the idea that whether it's a nation state or a cyber criminal who's inside your systems rooting around for well over a year and a third, something like that, they're not only building multiple entry points, they're building multiple exit points. So you can imagine when we learn, either through our own or because some third party notifies us, that we've got a significant cyber attack. What does the CEO say to us? David Robinson, what does the CEO say to you at the Hartford when you tell them that you have a major attack?
What are we going to do about it?
Yeah, and then what's the next thing that he says? Stop the bleeding, right? Stop it, David. Like, figure it out right away. Stop it. So you run over to your IT department and you say, my God, stop this thing right now. Shut it down. Don't let them. And it sounds lovely, but they have multiple entry and exit points. So you shut it down thinking you've closed like 2 doors, and you feel pretty good about yourself, David. You're going back into your CEO's office saying, I figured this one out. But in fact, if you think that you've closed it down, you haven't. So this idea of dwell time connected to your ability to really take proper defensive actions at that point. So what the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU, and also the New York State DFS is going to do is to really mandate notification almost immediately. So if you have a breach under different thresholds of significance or materiality, New York says now 72 hours to notify at least the regulator and probably the affected individuals. And the Europeans are basically saying the exact same thing. This will be a sea change in Europe. You know, if you think about the hacks that most of us read about in the newspapers, It's as if like 95% of them are occurring in the US, and that's just because we have mandatory breach notification laws. It's not like there's an iron dome over the rest of the world and breaches are not happening. They're happening everywhere. They're happening in nuclear plants. They're happening in power generation facilities. They are happening truly in every sector of society. But outside of the US, until the GDPR takes effect, there hasn't been this public notification obligation. And so you can imagine that once that kicks in, Oliver Wyman, one of our companies, put out a study yesterday saying that for the FTSE 100 companies, this will be a £5 billion issue per year in terms of what they're potentially subject to. The fines, if you don't get it right, are 4% of your turnover. For a company of ours, we have $13 billion in revenues, so you're talking about a $500 million fine, potentially, if you don't get this right. So just a ratcheting up of the stakes that is really extraordinary. So what other advice, Ari, do you have for people?
So, Peter, you just spoke about regulation and the changes that are taking place here locally in New York City, and certainly the GDPR that's going to affect the European countries as well. I think this is a good point, though, for me to highlight to all of you that the FBI is not a regulator. With regulations come regulators. The FBI is an investigative agency. And so I need to make that distinction very clear so that you know the collaborative piece of it sometimes holds you back from reaching out to the FBI because you don't understand the actual role. And so that role is that we do investigations. And I say that because you need to understand we don't go to the regulator, right? So when somebody approaches us and says we need help, we feel we've been compromised, and we begin that discussion, the FBI views you or your company as a victim, and we're not in the business of re-victimizing victims. It doesn't work that way. We'd have nobody to work with if that were the case. That being said, we don't go to the regulator. You all are smart enough as attorneys and as corporations, and you have your policies in place that when your regulatory obligation kicks in, you know who and when to go. That being said, again, we don't do that. It helps you. It's a lot better for you to be able to talk to your regulator and say, we've spoken with the FBI and we're working with them. That never hurts. It could only help. So that would be the distinction that I make here with regard to regulation. Regulators certainly exist, but the FBI is not a regulatory agency. We're investigatory, and we really are here to provide help and assistance, because not only does it impact you individually, and without giving up the identity of the victim, we push out further information that can help your peers in the respective sector.
So just as a sense for these folks, how many law firms have you gone and called on, or corporate law departments, and roughly kind of how many have come and reached out to you? Ballpark.
So this is a good example where I'm given and afforded a tremendous opportunity to be in front of all of you. And so we reach many people and many respective law firms in this fashion, and we've done several of these types of events. But I've personally probably been involved in reaching out to maybe upwards of 100 different law firms of various sizes. And there's so many here, right? I may not have touched you, but in terms of law firms reaching out and contacting us, very limited, minuscule in scale.
So, please.
What order of magnitude of...
And Ari, come on over. You're too far away, man.
Oh,
Yeah,
I wanted to give you your space. I don't want to get pushed through.
What order of magnitude of an event, a hack or attack, whether successful or averted, are you interested in hearing about?
So that's a great question, and the answer to that is all of them. The other part of that answer is we may not take that case on in terms of investigation, going back to what we spoke about very early on in terms of prioritizing our cases and which cases we follow through to its logical conclusion. And we always consult with our U.S. Attorney's offices, which here in New York City for us were very beneficial to have the great districts of the Southern District and the Eastern District of New York. So a breach we want to know about, a compromise we want to know about. Why? Because we still house all that information, all those indicators of compromise. So let's say we see a small hack that we're made aware of, that we're able to look at, and we get a script, a line, a signature, if you will. We'll house that. It's not a case we're going to actually actively investigate, right, because we can't, because of limited resources. But then on a bigger hack, we see the same signature. So now we have same signature in two different places. Now there's a little bit more of a focus, right? So that's why it helps, and that's why we want to know about it.
So how many of you can credibly say that your institution has really gone through a simulated cyber tabletop exercise? You're like raising your hand for everything. I want to know what company you're a part of. And so 2 people, truly out of a crowd of 3. Any takeaways from it? What'd you learn? Yeah, pretty brutal.
Everyone knows who they're supposed to contact, what they're supposed to do, and how they're supposed to do it, it minimizes the damage considerably.
Yeah, it's pretty stunning. There are 3 ideas I just want to put in your head that are some of the vexing issues that you'll have to deal with if you go through this. The first thing is you get all those people in the room. And who are some of them who should be in there? Legal, IT, CISO, CTO, who else? How about comms, folks? You got a saga. You're probably going to, under these new regs, you're probably going to have to notify. So you got to get your comms team, probably internal and external. Anybody else? Yeah, some sort of senior management within the company, you know, some business leader, something like that. Okay, so you now got 10 people around the room. I think you should probably have your forensic investigator there. Somebody from FireEye or CrowdStrike or some of these companies that are really good at trying to help you. If you're meeting that person for the first time in that crisis dynamic where David is screwed up over there, it gets very, very hard to do. So here's the first question. The communications people will say to you, we got to get out front of this story. We want to set the narrative. We want to define it. We want to learn from everybody else. And the legal folks are typically saying, well, what do we actually know at this point? Do we know how many people have in fact been impacted by the breach that has been occurred? And so you have this quite crushing dynamic in which you try to start drafting a press release, and it says, we've unfortunately been hacked. We take our security extraordinarily with great significance. And the comms people are saying, put a number in, and the lawyers are saying, don't put a number in. If you don't put a number in, you run the risk that folks think like, oh my Lord, every piece of your data has been compromised. And that's a lot of data that our companies have. If you put a number in, past experience says almost by definition your number will be wrong, and typically wrong on the low side when the IT department comes up and says, I'm sorry, it was a little bit bigger than we thought. So that's kind of issue number 1. There's not a solution to that, but if you haven't thought through any of those challenges in advance, it just makes it in a very stressful situation, that much harder to try to work that through. Issue number 2 is the management team will tell you, shut the systems down. I don't want any further access. I don't want any further making the situation worse. And others will say, well, listen, if we keep the systems open for a little while, we're more likely to find, in fact, where the places, where the areas of vulnerability are. And the third question is, should you contact somebody like Ari?
Yes.
Is that going to help us? Why do you say yes?
Because they have the tools, right, that we might not have. And they also know what else is going on, as you just indicated, Ari, right? You see the breadcrumbs that we can't possibly see.
She says because Ari has the tools, can kind of follow the trail of breadcrumbs going around. That's one very strong reason. Why would you not call law enforcement? There are tons of reasons, man. Gosh, I just want to like solve this problem myself.
The image of the company,
Yeah.
public.
Yeah, where is this going to go if I lose control if I start bringing that in? Again, there's no perfect answer to that, other than you have to recognize that these are some of the challenges that you're going to go through. From my vantage point on this is that if you know who the FBI is, you know who the Data Protection Authority is at the CNIL in France, or at the ICO in the UK, or other places, then you kind of say, well, it's not so scary because I have some sense of who that person is, and I think they will work with me. And then think of 2 V's when you do that, villain and victim. What you're trying to do in the early breaches, some of the big retailers, the retailer was the villain. Everybody said, like, how could you allow this to happen? You you dishonored your obligation. And what you're trying to do is position your company or your law firm, if you can, as being the victim. There are bad folks out there who are conducting the attack. You made a good faith effort. We all have enough humility about the strength of the modes of attack and how hard it is to defend yourself. And so try to see if you can position yourself as a victim. And that's a good way to think about law enforcement. Can law enforcement in their involvement, particularly if Ari is saying, I'm not a regulator, I'm here to try to help you figure out who did it, attribution as it's called in the space. That's at least a concept. What other questions are on your minds? Maybe just briefly, the man in the back?
I have actually two questions.
You have a
totally
mic right
unrelated.
there.
First, in a typical situation, does the head of IT security typically report to the head of IT and therefore the same person who's going to be held accountable for the mess? Second question, which flipped the subject. If the FBI has all this knowledge about what all the bad folks are doing, is our government using that knowledge and perhaps is doing it even better, I would hope, against all of the above?
I am definitely giving you that second question, Ari, without a doubt. So let me take a quick crack at the first one. Who should the CISO or the CTO report to? They're different models. Some people think it should be up through the IT chain to the Chief Information Officer. Other people say if this is such a big issue that it should have a reporting relationship perhaps to the CEO if you're a tech company or something like that. But here with this new regulation, a theme that I think is really important is if any of us act like this is an IT problem, the IT department will solve it. If anything goes wrong, it's the responsibility of the IT department. That's not a great attitude. And so what you see in the new Department of Financial Services regulation is they say, I want a certification from your company annually that you're doing this. You're doing the steps that we have set out that we think you should be doing around multi-factor authentication or encryption at rest. President Trump just issued an executive order to all the federal agencies. There have been bad hacks at the Office of Personnel Management and at various government agencies. Nobody's got the solution here. And one of the main lines of that executive order is that the head of the agency is accountable. So if you're in management, whether public or private, I think in some measure you have to figure out how to kind of own this or at least get conversant with it. All right, Ari, so how strong are our tools to attack other nations?
So that's a great question. That's a really great question. I'll answer it shortly, and then I'll add a little bit more after this. But the fact of the matter is I'm glad I'm an American citizen, and I live here in this country because we are the best at all of that. So that should answer the question in some way. Keep in mind, though, that the bad guys have no rules to be governed by, right? We, in law enforcement, we have to follow process. We have to get our search warrants, we have to build up the probable cause, and we have to go through process. While we are doing all of that, yes, we are a little bit behind, but every once in a while we do jump ahead. And the way we do that is by leveraging all the different information that's out there, not only within the FBI holdings, but we work with the rest of our intelligence community partners, and that is the NSA, and the CIA and DIA. And yes, we are part of the intelligence community, so we have access not only to our information, but to their information as well. And so we have the best investigators, the best cryptographers, and we combine our resources all together to engage in these investigations.
Well, but we also, not in the FBI, but we also have the best counter people.
So in any capacity and in any sector, there's always action and counteraction, countermeasures. We have excellent countermeasures, and they are implemented for purposes of protecting the homeland.
No, I mean going after the bad.
So offensive operations exist. Of course they exist. The FBI doesn't take part in offensive operations because that's not our mandate. We don't have those authorities.
There was a bill that was just introduced in the Congress yesterday about active defense, which means to actually go and really pursue your attacker outside of your network. Some people colloquially refer to it as up the tail. I don't personally believe that that's really the strongest method that most of our institutions should be going for. Other questions? Will you say who you are, if you would?
My first name is Anand, last name is Ahuja. I am an attorney by profession. You mentioned about financial service regulations. Bitcoin is not a regulated currency, so there are only two options. Number one, either we should make it a regulated currency so that we know the identity of the persons who are actually trading that at the currency exchange. Or if it remains as unregulated currency, then those who are dealing in Bitcoins, they should be criminally prosecuted, because unless we have a control on Bitcoins, we cannot control these bad actors, and we cannot stop them from extorting this money from the victims.
It's a fascinating question and really subject. Is this cryptocurrency, as a Bitcoin is called, which is really to conceal your identity and arguably to further crime? That's the negative gloss on it. There's also a positive gloss. There are normal commercial enterprises now that are relying on Bitcoin as an alternative form of currency. Have you prosecuted anybody, or has the Justice Department prosecuted anybody on Bitcoin
manipulation?
cases?
Not that I'm aware of, but we have engaged in investigations that have uncovered the chain link to the Bitcoin going back. So one of the purposes of using Bitcoin from a criminal perspective is this idea of the cryptocurrency. You can't trace it back. But there are methods and techniques that we're not going to identify that are utilized for purposes of, if you will, peeling the layer back to get back to the originating point or the receiving point.
I think one of the harder questions is, okay, so you get the ransomware attack. It typically has a big name like Tesla Crypt. All of your data has been encrypted, and there's a scary clock that is counting down saying, if you don't pay by this 24-hour time mark, then all your data is going to be destroyed. So this started really on some hospital chains in the West Coast, and they were actively involved in treating patients. The cost was de minimis. I think it was $18,000 in the situation with a West Hollywood hospital. So they paid it, and they publicly announced that they had paid it. I think probably for those of you who wish to pay the ransomware, my advice would be, if you go down that path, don't announce the fact that you've paid. Because literally within days, a whole series of hospital chains in California and then in Kentucky and then really around the country then became subject to virtually the same thing, which is Ari's point. Other questions? What's on your mind? Please.
What can be done and what is being done with respect to protecting our nation's infrastructure against hacking?
Yeah, it's a fabulous question. You want to start?
So sure. In July of 2016, President Obama signed into effect PPD 41, which sort of laid out the road map for how the federal government was going to address this issue. And so
PPD,
Presidential Policy Directive 41. My apologies. In the government, we use a lot of acronyms. So Presidential Policy Directive 41 signed into effect July 2016, laid out the ground rules. And so the Department of Homeland Security has what we call asset response, so that they are on the forefront of getting together with critical infrastructure sectors, and there's 16 sectors that have been identified, to take a look at their systems and see what it is they can do to harden it, to make it a more hard target. The Department of Justice, vis-a-vis the FBI, is responsible for threat response. So who are the bad actors behind the attacks? And the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, ODNI, they are in a support capacity for both functions to provide the intelligence, the overseas intelligence that they glean, to help support our functions. So specifically what we're doing, the FBI here in New York City, along with New York City Department of Environmental Protection, along with DHS, are getting together, and we're hitting all our critical infrastructure sites to do an analysis and get ahead of it. And a lot of precautions and safety measures are in place. But I will caveat that by saying there's no magic elixir to just cover it up. There is no iron dome that exists out there that can prevent it all. But we are actively engaged out there. Again, New York City Department, the police department, as well as the relevant critical infrastructure components that are responsible for hardening those targets.
It's been extraordinary how the threat has intensified just in literally 2 or 3 years. Think about the retailers. That was almost a year from kind of 14 to 15. They took your credit cards, maybe 100 million of them, sounded really grim. At the same time, the banks could cut off the credit card, so the consumer was not on the line for it. So the hackers wanted something that couldn't be cut off. So then they morphed to Social Security numbers. And so that was really a lot of the hospital chains that got hit, because once they had your social number, they could do tax fraud, they could do healthcare fraud. But really what we've seen now in the last 12 months or so is that there's no sector of critical infrastructure. Think power plants, water facilities. If they cut off the water or the power to this building, the disruption that would occur in the wake of that is really quite profound. Chemical facilities, dams, just really on down the line that are now, unfortunately, I think, credibly in play. Other questions? Please.
So in an
Yep.
effort to strike a more optimistic
Yes, please. We need it. Yeah.
do you see a lot of credibility added for information security when you're using things like ISO 27001 and those kind of standardized ISMS policies? Do they help? Is there a point in going down that route?
So I think there is. I think the various standards that have been promulgated out there to sort of guide behavior, guide sort of design and implementation, how you set up your network topography, segmentation, things of the technical nature of it, I think is very well worth going down that road. Again, all of that is subject to budget and availability of resources within each respective organization. But you have the critical control standards that we can follow, the 20 standards there, or the NIST formula, right? All of that is good. The bottom line, though, to simplify it for those who are not tracking kind of what we're discussing here, it's generally a defense in depth approach, right? So in the center of these concentric circles that are surrounding it, we have all the valuable information, those pieces of information that we want to protect. And we start off with maybe a router, a firewall, and then we expand that out further, maybe to two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication that takes biometrics into consideration. Then maybe a little further out you have IDS or intrusion detection system, intrusion protection systems. And so we keep expanding the circle so that if one layer of defense is penetrated, hopefully the next layer picks it up and you get that reporting going on.
Do you know what multi-factor authentication is? Most people? Some? Are you still with me, everybody? Yeah. Okay, pretty good. So think of Bloomberg, just briefly. Bloomberg terminal. You sign on to your Bloomberg. You put your password in. Multi-factor or two-factor just means a second form of authentication, that you are really that person. So on the digital screen, you just do your biometric swipe, your digital swipe, but it's with the smartphone. A lot of people are getting codes put into the smartphone. You then enter that. Just something other than password. I think the other thing for many, many of our institutions is to think how many vendors provide services to you. The paper supply company, the air conditioning supply company, on down the line. For a company like ours, we have 40,000 different vendors providing services to us. A decent number of them are hooked up into our system. And so your security in the center is really only as credible as at least some base level of security. So you have to figure out something that you can do as opposed to just saying we're good and everybody else, it's too complicated, it's too many folks. Other questions? Please, in the back of the room over there.
So, to the extent you're not regulated.
A mic is just coming. Will you say who you are?
Jonathan Slonim, in-house counsel at McKinsey. To the extent one is not regulated over email retention, do you have any recommendations around, is severely restricting retention periods for email something you would advocate, or is that something where that's not where we should even be focusing anymore?
Did you catch it?
Just punted it over, Peter.
I think you should. And one of the things that you see, it is a luxury to be in a great company like yours, but also a private company. Both for the GDPR and the New York Department of Financial Services reg, they talk about data minimization. And this idea that it's good practice to just keep everything forever, that is not good practice. And so how you go about that, if you're a public company, it's a little bit trickier to do that in a prudent way. But clearly for private institutions, I think having mailbox size be limited, rolling over, auto deletion over a period of time, those kinds of things make good sense. Another question in the back?
Slightly unrelated, but there's something out there called the dark web. Is the dark web still dark?
Ari?
If it weren't dark, they wouldn't call it the dark web. So, I mean, I want to understand a little bit more what that question is about, because the dark web references the onion router or the Tor network, and that is that part of the internet that hasn't been indexed yet. So because it hasn't been indexed, there's a lot of activity that takes place, from child sexual trafficking to narcotics trafficking. So, I mean, I want to understand.
The comment is too technical for my brain. What I'm talking about is, what I understand, many years ago, our government developed what was called the dark web, which was able to basically be used by spies inside the Soviet Union and China to communicate in a way where those countries would not be able to detect them. And this system has morphed into a monster where terrorists can communicate with terrorists without, which, because of the technology where the signals are just bouncing around the world, they can't be traced.
Let me take the pressure off you on that one. I knew it was going to come back to Russia at some point in the process. It just had to. I think the process of encryption is a really vexing, complicated issue. The dynamic that the FBI had with Apple in the past year or two, when terrorists and people who really do not have our best intentions at heart are communicating in a way you really understand when Director Comey or people like that are passionately saying that we're going dark and the like. At the same time, you know, the government authorities do have some obligations as well. The General Counsel and President of Microsoft issued quite a strong letter in the wake of the WannaCry attack, saying that that was allegedly an NSA developed exploit that was stolen by the outside forces, and then only at that point did the NSA notify Microsoft, so that Microsoft then could put a patch out to all people like us to try to bolster our systems. I think we're about out of time. David, last question?
So Peter and Ari, when the New York EFS came out with its first draft, it included, I think, a requirement to notify attempted breaches. And then in the final draft, they took that out. You mentioned vendors, so we all have lots of vendors. We are also vendors ourselves, and there's starting to be a movement, especially by our large customers out there that we all service, to require companies to inform them of suspected breaches and do it within a certain time period. So they're becoming sort of regulators of us because they're very concerned about the data that we have of theirs. From a policy perspective, if that, you know, starts to perpetuate itself, that requirement that we all inform our customers of suspected breaches, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Where does that lead us?
From my perspective, I think making the distinction between attempted and suspected is important. The attempted breach happens every day. Millions and millions of port scans are taking place right now as we're speaking, right? Is that an attempted breach? I don't know, but it's an attempt to look and see what's open. The suspected breach may be something a little bit more than that. Is it a good idea to make that notification? I think it is. More information is better than less. It allows that person or that entity an opportunity to take a look at their system, keeping in mind the average time they're on the system is 100 and some odd days. So that may lead them, even though their search and analysis of that suspected breach may not be specifically related, it may lead them to something else and see something else that's going on. Most times, here I'll mention, most companies realize the compromise is taking place after information has been exfiltrated from the system.
Can I just say, David, I was so disappointed in that question. I mean, David is the general counsel of the Hartford. I am the general counsel of Marsh & McLennan. We both sell tons of cyber insurance to people like you, and I thought surely that was going to be a softball coming my way. So everybody, offense is a lot easier in this realm than defense. And so we are literally going to be grappling with this issue in different forms, I think more severe forms for the rest of our lives, rest of our careers at least. So thank you, everybody, and thank you to Ari.